I'm first going to do a lot of setup, including defining what a market maker is. Then I'm going to have 3 points of standard on price transparency, on why brokerages would take on too much risk, and on smaller exchanges. Firstly, on smart setup, what is a market maker? If I want to sell a stock right now, probably no one is looking to buy it right this very instant. But I want to sell right now because it gives me security. So a market maker buys that stock from me, it holds it for a little bit, and then it sells it to the next person in the line. The way they make their money is on volatility, because they take on the risk of uncertainty if the price they buy it from me and the price they're able to sell it is the same or slightly larger. But importantly, when their models of what the price accurately should be is, they make money. So that's why volatility and price changes are very good for market makers when they have the best models. Secondly, what do brokerages do? Brokerages hold stock on the behalf of other person. For example, if I called up the stock exchange right now, I was like, I want to buy Tesla. They're like, who the fuck is this guy? Brokerages act on my behalf. They make money at a flat or percentage on every trade. For example, that's like $10 for every stock that I buy on ASX or something. And the way they make money is more trades being good. Thirdly, how do stock exchanges work? The way they work is that they publicly list information. They ensure everything is compliant. For example, companies have to pay them to be listed on that stock exchange, and for that stock to be publicly available and the information to be shared. They provide lots of services in terms of information transfer and compliance. So they want just lots of stocks to be on their stock exchange, everything to be well regulated. Finally, on setup, what does internalization look like and what's the alternative? It looks like brokerages internally being the market maker. Let's say they'll buy and sell it from you to other people who use the same brokerage. And importantly, what the alternative looks like is that market makers compete on the public market, on the stock exchange, if you don't have internalization. Probably in either world, a market maker is buying it from you. The question is if market makers are competing against each other. The question is if the market maker also happens to be the brokerage at the same time. First point of substantive, on price transparency. The reason why this is really bad is just if you look at the info slide, the stock exchange got cut out, right? That in the same way that if I decided to privately transfer one share to my mom, or my mom decided to transfer that to me, we didn't need to disclose that price to anyone else. We didn't have to disclose it. The stock exchange, all that was internally hidden. And the reason, and that is going to happen to a mass scale if you just do internalization. Because that brokerage firm is the one that has control of all the information, it has no obligation to disclose that information. It also is extremely unlikely to. The reason why is because access to information, especially in financial markets, is just very important. It is the comparative advantage you have, especially in the industry of market making, which is about accurate predictions of how prices are moving right now. Obviously, this can't be regulated against, for example, by just claiming that you would force market makers internalization to disclose the information. For the simple reason that a lot of the time, it is just going to be brokerages that you have very little ability to scrutinize their books, etc. So then why is inaccurate information bad? That's to say, the price that the majority of these internalized trades are going to not be disclosed to the stock exchange. That means that no one else is going to know about them. Maybe if you use the same brokerage, they're going to be like internally disclosed. But if Commsec has a certain price based on its internalized trades, Robinhood definitely doesn't have information about that. Institutional investors definitely don't have information about that because it never goes to the stock exchange. The reason why information transfer is extremely important is because you need accurate information to accurately allocate capital. That's to say, people would buy more if they knew that the price was actually lower and there are people willing to sell at a lower price. They would change the decision making. That buying and selling accurately allocates capital in an efficient way. Also, for example, if a stock is plummeting and all of that information is just hidden because the majority of it is just done within Robinhood trading, the fact that no one else knows the price is plummeting is really bad for them because they also don't know to get out. Or, for example, that the stock is underpriced and therefore they should be taking the other end of the trade and buying, in fact. That explains why information in general is always good to be transferring. The impact of this is also that the majority of people do own shares and trade shares in some capacity because if you have a 401k retirement fund, that essentially means they own shares and trade them on your behalf. If you, for example, put any money inside an endowment, all of these things have shares to some capacity. That means it affects all people. Second point of substantive, why do brokerages take on too much risk? As I flagged in my introduction, market makers make money based on volatility, whereas brokerages make money just on the volume of trades, which explains why there's a slight separation where they would possibly make or lose money in different cases. This brokerages are likely to want to do also become a market maker because it allows them access to a new stream of capital, especially where one they feel they have a comparative advantage. They're likely to think that they can make a lot of money based on it, especially when the alternative is retail investors who are often locked into the brokerages. Like how often they move between Robinhood and Commsec is not that high because the average retail investor does not think that critically about it, which means that that they are relatively locked into their brokerage. That explains why brokerages are going to want to be the market maker, but this can go extremely bad for them. The reason why is because if their market making skills are very bad, then they're going to lose a lot of money. That is bad both for the brokerage, but the way they're specifically going to lose money is they're going to borrow against the stocks they own on behalf of other people. The reason why this is the case is just because obviously a brokerage owns the stock on your behalf. It still is able to, for example, borrow against them. Or the government does insure against the loss of a particular brokerage going under, but that still means the government has to bail them out. They actually have the ownership in a financial sense. You've just given them your rights to buy things on your behalf. And so what this looks like is that the brokerage wants to be a market maker. You need a lot of liquidity to be a market maker because you need to be able to buy, hold for a short period of time, and then sell. You need the liquidity in the interim. And the way they're going to get that liquidity is borrowing against the shares they own on the behalf of other people. And when things go wrong, when, for example, there are huge swings in volatility, or when, for example, their market-making models are extremely inaccurate, that often is correlated in a way they lose a lot of money all of a sudden. And that's likely to lose the money so fast that they entirely go under. Obviously, this is symmetric for another market maker, but the difference is the other market maker didn't borrow liquidity based on other people's shares. When the brokerage, which is also acting as the market maker, goes under, this means that it loses all the capital it had, which was the ownership of other people's shares. That was incredibly bad because that means ordinary people had their shares lost. When the government had to bail them out, that cost the government a lot of money. Third point of the standard, on smaller exchanges. I think that a lot of scandals or bad accounting malpractices and bad company practices I find out is by accurately tracking the trades that did or did not happen. For example, the Enron scandal often had to do with company CEOs moving around their shares in a very convoluted way amongst themselves. The way they were able to be accurately tracked is if that information is publicly disclosed. But if there's less of a public ledger of the trades that are happening, that makes it harder to regulate against malpractice. If, for example, people doing market manipulation, if the CEOs are siphoning money, or if they're doing public trading on privileged information. That was all incredibly bad. Stock exchanges were uniquely able to regulate against them because they often had the strongest incentive to be ensure that everyone was compliant, because the way stock exchanges are incentivized is to make sure that everyone can feel safe exchanging on the stock market, whereas stock market, that didn't happen, which means that compliance was much harder to regulate. The impact of this is that price manipulation is much harder to be unchecked, that CEOs are able to be corrupt, and you're not able to find out about them. At the end of the day, brokerages want to take on a high risk because they can think about the high rewards, but they don't feel the problem. But they're able to borrow against other people's monies and lose their gamble with other people's monies. That was incredibly bad. We stopped this with internalization.
Thank you, First Negative, for that speech, and now by Secretary.
Firstly, on price transparency, on access, where we clearly win this debate, then on price transparency, risk, and protection from the harms that exist in the market if you're a retail trader. Firstly, in terms of access, the reason I'm starting here is because it is just where we have the most clear victory. Because it is just empirical fact, they do 0% brokerage fees, that it is far cheaper to trade with these people, with Robinhood. There's a reason people go to Robinhood than they do go to other places that act as normal brokerage fees. They're not banned from doing that. And the reason they're selecting it is because it is cheaper, because it is easier, because it is something that is far more accessible to them. And that is an access that is cut out by these people. They care about price transparency and the impacts of that. That is obviously affected by whether or not people can trade in the first place. The information those traders would have only gets revealed to the market on our side when they have the capacity to trade, impacting the arguments that they describe about. Furthermore, I would just say trading is just enormously beneficial to people. It enables people to access something that is far greater in terms of increasing their wealth than the interest their bank would provide them. It allows people to access the benefits and improvements to an economy that they are largely locked out of by corporations. And I would say that is a huge benefit in this debate. It's one that only exists if people can themselves trade stocks. Something that is blocked out on their side because of the exorbitant fees that exist when you engage with a normal broker, that are maybe less so when you're doing massive high volume trades, but for the people we're talking about, the more vulnerable people, people who are students, people who are retirees, who have less money that they're investing, are people who invest better, invest more on our side and aren't locked out by these kinds of flat fees that exist on the other team's side. So what do they say in response to this? They just say that you need to make money somewhere. We describe to you where you're making that money, and you're no longer making that money in a way that requires you to have a flat fee, that requires you to have a brokerage fee. That is to say that you are just like making money now off of being the market maker, I guess, which is being the market maker and being the person that is running the market. That is to say, you're able to produce a spread there that allows you to get money off of this without necessarily having this flat fee. But again, I would identify that this is empirically true, that we do just have these 0% brokerage fees and commission fees that exist on these platforms. It is just like ahistorical to suggest that they're not. They have a couple of responses. They say that like, oh, you need to make lots of money though, because now you're taking on more risk. Because like, what if the buyer's price and the sell prices are like bad for you? Like suggesting you have like a negative spread somehow all of a sudden. But two responses. The first one is to say that obviously it's comparing it to the price where you bought it, whether that be the fact that you are connecting two people, which doesn't really produce any risk, because oftentimes there's two people who are going to buy and sell something at similar times, or at least close enough that this isn't a meaningful impact in this debate. But also, I would say that the person running Robinhood and deciding whether or not when they build their surplus they use to connect people, that is like disconnected time-wise, is probably more intelligent, smarter, and faster than the person who is engaging in that retail investing. Which suggests the spread between Robinhood buying from the market itself and connecting that to investors, connecting that to retail investors, is probably one that produces a positive spread for them that is good for them. But furthermore, I would say that you're still able to use volatility that exists in the actual stock market to over time into the future produce an effective spread for you that enables you to make money off of it. That is to say, even if like your current backlog of stocks that you have that you could be connecting to a user, if you don't currently have a user who can be connected to someone who is selling, would be worse for you. You could just buy it from the actual market then and connect that to that person, which allows you to still make money and have at least a relatively effective spread. Overall though, what we do is we cut out a service fee that exists with exchanges. That is a huge benefit to this debate. It means that every trade becomes cheaper for individuals who are trading in the market, and that is the thing that locks people out from accessing trading on the affirmative side of this debate. Now then, let's talk about price transparency. 5 responses. They claim here is just prices are hidden all of a sudden. 5 responses. Firstly, this is untrue. Obviously, you could know what the buy and sell price and the amount of people selling and buying on the Robinhood market is, because Robinhood needs to tell its users what their buy and sell prices is. It's deeply perplexing to me how the users on Robinhood are allowed to know this, but the institutional investors somehow are blocked out from knowing this. Secondly, we obviously can model this in a way that can fix just this price transparency that exists. They just ambiguously say that we can't for some reason. Obviously, you're able to reveal the buy and sell prices, how much people are buying and selling things for on your platform, and still maintain the way that the platform functions. It's not impossible for you to be a market maker while revealing your buy and sell prices in the same way that existing stock markets reveal their buy and sell prices. The third thing is to say we flip this. We explain why increased congestion on markets restricts price signals. That is to say, on their side, even though we explain lots of people get cut out, people are now still forced onto the actual market and actual exchanges, which increase the amount of volume flowing through them, which again distorts price signals because it delays them. It causes things to be a bit more sticky in the market, which decreases the effectiveness and the speed at which those price signals are transferred onto the market, which obviously decrease their quality in terms of the things that they talk about as to why information is so valuable on a market. The fourth thing we say is that we explain that the practice increases access to trading, which again, even if they can't do it on the open market, as I said before, is an impact on the information that exists more broadly, because you can see that lots of people are selling on the Robinhood market, which explains then that there is a massive impact in that price signal. Furthermore, even if you don't believe that that is massively impactful, even though it is delayed, we at least mitigate this by the fact that Robinhood ends up exchanging the ways in which they buy and sell on their own platform to the way in which they themselves buy and sell on the actual market, which explains why that is a meaningful impact in this debate. The final thing to say is that it is, and obviously if two people are buying and selling and they're being directly traded with each other in terms of matching a buyer and seller directly, that would have a net zero impact on the price of a good in the market, of a price of a stock in the market. It's about when disproportionately people are buying. The final thing is to say that it's unclear if it is true that this kind, this kind of like super shocking like rise or fall of a stock is going to happen first on the retail investors on Robinhood, as opposed to from institutional investors. Like obviously it happens when you have massive like individuals collectivizing in the way they did around Robinhood, but actual meaningful things that care about the actual price of a stock as whether it is super over or undervalued are things that are probably found out first by institutional investors. They're the ones that have lots of money, that puts lots of money into their research. They're the ones that have the most stake in the game about whether or not the market is being correctly valued of these prices, and they're the ones that probably find out first. So it's deeply unclear to me why those people are unlikely to, like, I guess, have access to the information first. The final thing I would say is I'm perfectly fine if retail investors have more information and make better trades than like institutional investors. That just seems like a good thing. It seems like you benefit people who generally are worse off at a competition metric against institutional investors. Their claim is harming institutional investors because they have less information, but obviously this means that it is relatively a benefit to the group of people that I would say are more vulnerable in this debate. Now then, let's talk about risk. They say firstly that you're locked into certain brokers. It's a premise to this. This is just untrue. Their response is to say, oh, you have to pay capital gains. Obviously, that doesn't impact your future investments, which is something that the brokerage would still care about. We explained it is relatively easy to switch between brokers. It is very easy. I could, within like 5 minutes, make an account on Robinhood and start investing. And that kind of thing means that I can switch my investments. Furthermore, new investors come into the market every day. That is something that they want to capture. That is how they set and define whether or not they should have these kinds of fees that exist. Secondly, obviously, this is more true on their side. The reason that we explained that these are so easy to access as investors, and they're saying that it's distinct on their side. The next thing is then about brokerage taking loans of stocks, and that's what increases their risk. Two responses. Firstly, they need to be hugely off in many places for this risk to meaningfully manifest. That is to say, the brokerage and the market maker is extraordinarily diversified here. They need to be so off in their estimations of the market across various stocks for this to be meaningfully true. But it's not true that every retail investor is engaging in this massive kind of manipulation on several stocks, which means that it is unlikely this kind occurs in such a way that would take the entire brokerage firm down. Secondly, they largely don't need to, for the reason they are matching buyers and sellers on their own market, which means that they don't need to have a massive backlog of stocks that they can provide to sellers. That is to say, this works in the example of like Robinhood and GameStop, where they needed far more GameStop stocks than they had on hand. But oftentimes you're just matching people who are buying and selling their Apple or Tesla stocks, which means it is something that is fairly easy to do. Retail investors generally invest in like the most big stocks, which means it is fairly easy to understand and estimate what they are likely to buy, which means you don't end up in this kind of situation where you're massively off from your predictions. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
The first thing that I want to do in the speech is address the material about fiat and the counter model, because I just think that the types of regulations that they prompt are far more invasive to the information and the sense of profit that these companies have, and I think are just probably far too high in fiat for them to get meaningful reforms in the ways that they suggest. The first thing they say is they can do things like have price matching, or like ways to get like minimum or like certain prices matched between sites. I think the first problem with this is it just requires these companies to provide all of their information to the stock exchange in the first place, especially the ways in which they calculate the prices of certain stocks. And this is what data the companies are by far the most protective of, because it's the way that they make their money. Because by changing and by, I guess, comparing the ways in which they predict certain prices, you can do things like figure out things about that company's algorithm, and that algorithm that predicts the ways that stocks are likely to go is just the way that they make the majority of their money. It's the thing that they're most protective of, not the specific method by which they predict where the stock will go or what money they make on top of that. But the second thing is just to note that you can't do some of the things that they suggest about, because they would be far too unpopular. Things like minimum liquidity standards are just things that are like broadly not super popular, or I guess would be even more unpopular in the space that they're talking about, and would just affect large investors in a number of categories as well, because minimum liquidity standards or like inability to leverage over a certain amount, I think is just affects all large-scale institutional investing, affects all large financial institutions. It would just be far too unpopular. And these, I guess, like doing it to specifically regulate this particular group, clearly I don't think would, I guess, like overcome that benefit. But the last thing I want to note here is just the abundance of information that they're suggesting the average consumer or the average investor has to process. Because they say that you need to provide all of these prices to the central exchange, and then people can compare between all of them. But I just want to note ahead of time that this is probably just inefficient at the outset, and you probably shouldn't consider it a wise way to do things compared to having one centralized price that is calculated by all of these competing on the exact same market rather than existing in separate markets for reporting everything. It doesn't really make sense. It's just just a response to transparency. So let's deal with transparency first, and then let's go to accountability second. Firstly, on transparency. They make a number of claims saying that regular people are likely to access these stocks because you don't have fees, or I guess commission or exchange fees, and you don't necessarily get like good prices quoted to you. The first thing to note here is just if this is totally free, it is completely unclear how they're likely to make large profits under the alternative side as well. They never explain how these companies are likely to make their money, and we clearly just suggest to you that the way that they would have to do it instead is just by having much higher risk. Because what this does is it just massively lowers your margins, right? And the fact that you have to take on such a large percentage of liquidity and such a large percentage of capital to make those infinitely small margins something that is able to generate you a functional profit just means that you're likely to take on far more assets under their side than you do on the outside, which I think just exposes you to far more risk, as we explained at Neil, to very minimal response. But the last thing to say here is just like it's unclear why zero fee trading exists as a positive, because it just means people are likely to engage in far less considered investing. This is explained at Hamish with zero response in that speech. It's just unclear that the average person, first of all, has the financial literacy to correctly trade or predict where stocks are likely to go. It's just unclear they even want to engage in this much large volume of trading in the first place. A lot of people do it for a small amount of money on the side. People that are seriously committed to it largely don't make a lot of money in the first place. They maybe make a lot of losses. But the last thing to note is people just don't have the time to high frequency trade. Like if I'm a regular fucking person, I do not have the time to sit at my computer 8 hours a day and look for small variations in price where I'm able to make my profits. And because you're not very financially literate, you're probably not even likely to make those profits if you have that amount of time to dedicate in the first place. Completely unclear why their accessibility actually affects a large amount of people, and not just these small amount of like hustle grind set dudes that like work 15 hours a day at a computer to try and make a little bit of money. But the last thing to note is just it's sometimes bad because these platforms can be engaged in harmful levels of allowing access to retail investing. When Robinhood was involved in a massive scandal around, or like a relative like scandal around the allowing of people to invest massively in GameStop, and a shit ton of people lost their money on it, that affects people's confidence in the platform as a whole. And when you allow some people risky access to retail investing, and they abuse that access to retail investing, it just worsens people's access to financial markets in the first place, and it gives retail investing an incredibly bad name. So that probably reduces people's engagement with financial markets in the first place. It ruins people's trust, and that is probably far worse, and it clearly just creates the harms that they talk about. But the last thing to note is just they never explain why people wouldn't be willing to pay transaction fees. It's a cost of business. If you still want to make a small amount of money off it, there's no reason they explain why these transaction fees would be particularly high, because the average person is not a fucking high frequency trader. If you're a small-time retail investor, you are just never clearly trading enough stocks that these transaction fees start to pile up in the ways that they suggest, and it becomes inaccessible. The second thing they talk about is just that it clogs up the public exchanges, and I think this point is just probably rubbish. Firstly, market makers still buy it from you, which means it's still an instant transaction where it occurs on the stock exchange as opposed to through the broker. It's still a market maker that's buying it and acting as a purveyor. They just don't also run the exchange that you're buying it through. It's just through the top stock exchange you list the price on, or that you buy the stock from, and then the market maker is the one that's purveying that stock back and forth, or holding that stock in exchange for people to trade it. But the last thing to note is just, they say it like keeps the lanes clear for institutional trading. It's not a highway. Like you can trade these things all at the same time. It makes zero sense that you'd be able to clog up the market in the way that they suggest. And information transfer is just incredibly quick. We've had decades to refine the processes through which we transfer information and financial information back and forth. It's just incredibly unclear that we are not able to cope with the load of transferring a lot of shares very quickly. It's currently what we do in every single other market. Unclear why it doesn't work here. But the last thing to note is it's just way worse when the market never gets the information in the first place. Because they say you keep the lanes clear for institutions, but it's just like incredibly unclear how much large institutional trading gets better at the point where you don't have the accurate price information. That makes you far less confident to invest in it in the first place. It's just unclear having all of those different prices competing against each other is something which makes it easier for institutional investors, and especially it's not something that makes it easy for retail investors who are now comparing and accessing a number of different brokerage, looking at a number of different brokerage firms, unclear exactly how to engage with the market. The last thing they say here is that it's just better when you get things like mandatory price reporting. But the first thing that I want to note here is just, as already explained, it's a massive amount of time and experience. The last thing is it's just very expensive to have to verify all of these prices, because you have to check that the underlying stock has a certain amount of value. You have to, I guess, like verify that there's buyers on both ends of the exchange. Not 100% sure how it works. You have to do a lot of checking and a lot of investment of time and resources to make sure that the prices that all of these brokerage firms are quoting to the stock market are accurate or reflect actual transactions, which is just a large amount of investment of capital that is completely unnecessary in this case, because it means that there is just then less money actually flowing into the market and much more money flowing into regulating a very expensive and difficult to run system. On the alternative, we explain the market makers instead compete on the stock exchange. Their their only response to this is just saying now these companies can compete internally. But obviously your interests are assigned with only one of these brokerage firms and they don't compete against each other. Because firstly, information sharing with different brokerage firms just means that I guess you're more likely to have clashing with different prices. Like when you have different exchanges, I guess, competing also with different brokerage firms, you just get a lot of confusion and prices and assets moving around in particularly bad and weird ways that are very inefficient for the market. But also just secondly, many investors are just loyal to the brokerage platforms they choose. It's incredibly annoying to have to do things like set up accounts. These are things that the average retail investor does kind of care about. It is just difficult to get invested in one brokerage firm. And if you do, okay, you probably trust it, or you, I guess, like believe to some extent you have like a, I don't know, maybe a sunk cost fallacy about what you choose. The last thing to note is they say more retail investors access and compete in the market, but obviously this isn't relevant because this is just competition over the stock or the asset or the price itself. It's not a competition to have more investors in the market for the brokerage firms to compete over getting access to the business of. That point doesn't really make sense to me. Lastly, on accountability, I just want to note that we get an independent path to victory here through access to information. But it's far easier when you have accountable ledgers, when you have actual records of all the transactions, and when you have prices that are very easy to verify because they're occurring through a single source. That means you get less financial mismanagement, you get far less fraud, and you get less bad practices from these brokerages. The last thing to note here is just that the risk, I guess, is particularly bad under their side of the case because they have high frequency trade, because you have a much larger pools of liquidity and assets which you are borrowing against, because your margins are smaller, so you have to take bigger risks in order to make any money at all. The average investor is now exposed to all of this risk. So even if you get them in the first place, they're just far more vulnerable to the ways that these companies make money when it's not through a direct brokerage fee. You can't see where the money is being made, then the money is being made off of you. So proud to negate.
Go. Great. I'm going to begin on access. It's the cleanest and simplest way to decide who wins this debate. We lower the barriers to entry for retail investors to invest. What responses do we receive? First, zero commission trading can't happen, which is just a misunderstanding of how it works. Which is to say that in our world, brokers don't get paid by the retail investor, they instead get paid by the market maker, because the market maker gives them a slice of the fee, allowing them to execute the trade, which is how it works, which is why we're able to get zero commission trading. Next, they say, well, by making it easier for people to opt in and out of stock trading, that means that you actually create a moral hazard such that ordinary people overinvest and therefore overinvest such that they exceed their risk portfolio, which is very strange. Firstly, if you can see that it's easy for people to opt in and also opt out of the market, they can also opt out of the market, which means this harm does not really make sense. Second of all, just because you are making it easy to do X does not mean that you create a coercive influence upon that actor to do more of X than they otherwise would. And they've never really explained why that coercive factor manifests. They say these people are not very well informed. Well, that's what the broker's for, right? And if the broker misinforms you, well, then you can go and take your business to another broker. You could report that broker for misinforming you, and therefore that broker loses their license. And the third thing that we would say is that it's not true that these people are as risk averse as this team would likely have you believe. Because their argument only works if you believe that these people are ultra risk averse, opt into this, and therefore by making it easier, this gives them the encouragement to then invest excessively over their risk portfolio. It's unlikely that these people are as risk averse as they say, which is to say that these are the set of people who have, instead of, for example, not investing altogether or not investing in an index fund, have chosen to pursue this model, which means that this set of people are probably slightly more informed, have a greater risk appetite than this affirmative team would have them credit for, and it's no argument from the negative team to suggest why these people aren't a captive audience, given the alternatives that I've just outlined, or are as uninformed and easily coercible as this team would have you believe. Which means that these are people who make good decisions, and we make their ability to make those decisions easier, and we impose fewer and less costs upon them. The way in which the affirmative response is sort of in an attempt to pincer us. They say, well, either these brokers don't make people a lot more money, or it does so in a way that encourages brokers to take on massive risk. Here's why that false binary doesn't work. In terms of why it doesn't make people a lot more money, the problem with this response is that it just constrains the size of benefits for both teams in this debate, right? Because if it is the case that these deals, internalized deals, do not make people a lot more money, it's unclear how that volume of money meaningfully affects prices and therefore meaningfully interrupts price discovery in their world. So unfortunately, this response only symmetrizes the scale of both teams are talking about. But acutely and importantly, it doesn't affect us, right? Because having a little bit more money is more important for very ordinary investors because they have far less money to begin with. So any minimal effect on the market price has a less of a marginal corresponding proportionally effect on ordinary investors because they have less money to begin with. So even if it's just a little bit more, it matters more to them. But secondly, it's just not true that brokers have to take on enormous amounts of more risk in order to make more money. That's to say that they, firstly, just need to make trades that are smarter than the average retail investor, which is very easy to do because per their characterization, people are not as informed as brokers, which is why it's easier to meet that bar. Or secondly, they engage in a spread to make money, both between users and between users and the market. So all those alternatives suggest that it's unlikely that brokers take on massive risk in order to compensate for their deals. Users will get paid, and that means that people are actually able to make money without accessing that risk. So that just simply means that we very definitively make it far more affordable for people. Why is that more important? And I want to note that even if you believe that this model makes it somewhat more inefficient for institutional investors, but makes it more efficient for retail investors, you all prioritize the impact to retail investors. And that's for two reasons. First is because empowering retail investors helps out the people most directly that we care the most about, which is, say, the ordinary Joe. Because presumably the only reason why you would want to make it more efficient for institutional investors because those people are investing on behalf of average people, like hedge funds and index funds, etc. But we directly help out the ordinary investor who's making these trades themselves. And that's why we more directly help the people that we care about the most. Secondly, because the ordinary Joe is far more vulnerable, both in the sense that they have less money than the average institutional investor, which means that there's diminishing returns to helping institutional investors who are already wealthy compared to ordinary people, but also because they're less able to insulate themselves from the harms of an inefficient market, because they have less money, because they have less expertise, which is why you should prioritize efficiency for the retail investor as opposed to institutional investor. So we've won on this issue and therefore won the debate very, very clearly. I'll now move on to the other way in which the Affirmative team tried to win this debate, which is on improving price transparency in the public exchange market. And it's worth noting all the kind of hurdles that they need to clear before they even reach the finish line in this issue. They first have to explain why we can't just make brokers disclose. Then they have to explain why the impactance of retail investors meaningfully affects the market price and therefore strategy of institutional investors. And then, even then, they need to explain why the novel information they're adding to the price discovery process is useful information, that it shifts the price in the right ways rather than clogging the system or adding unnecessary traffic and noise to the system. So, firstly, why can't brokers disclose? Well, at first they just say, well, there's insufficient scrutiny on brokers in the status quo. Correct, which is why we're adding to the scrutiny on brokers in the status quo counter model. And then Felix tries a bunch of clever sophistry in his third half speech, but a simple intuition you would just need to believe is that it is more popular to restrict an activity that people want to do than to outright ban you from doing that activity in the first place, which is precisely why their argument that our counter model assumes more political capital than banning it altogether makes complete bunk of sense. So that is why you're able to do that. Other thing to say is that Felix's conception of our counter model is wrong. It requires you to believe that we're requiring people to disclose how you predict data as opposed to just disclosing past data. So past data on when you bought batches of stocks and what prices you bought those stocks on. Those things do not compromise your algorithm and therefore violate your intellectual property or whatever, which is why brokers are happy to comply. So that one doesn't work. And if brokers can disclose the information, then there's virtually no imperative for the Affirmative team. But I now will engage with them far more charitably. Assuming that we can't make them disclose, why is this a harm? Why does the pattern of retail investors meaningfully affect the market price? A vast majority of our characterization explains to you that ordinary people trade very tiny amounts. They trade 100 shares per trade, they share round dollar amounts, fractions of shares, compared to the massive volume of trade that's done by institutional investors. People in our world get to make trades that involve tens of hundreds of dollars, which matters to them, but is genuinely just a penny in the ocean of money that institutional traders are working with. This does not meaningfully affect the market price. And if that works, that means that we get our benefit and we get to eat our cake and have it too, because it doesn't really meaningfully affect the market price. But lastly, and perhaps most importantly, even if it affects the market price, why does it necessarily not make that price more fairer? Because their entire case would have you believe that the extra information that retail investors, so the extra information that retail investors are inputting in the system is valuable information about what people's preferences want. But crucially, the only way in which that happens is if retail investors are, rather than following the trend that's facilitating the price, is now driving the trend, which now would have you believe that in order for their argument to be operative, they would have you believe that the ill-informed retail investor is somehow more likely to spot a market inefficiency than the rest of the institutional investors. It seems more likely that if it does impact the market price, it's more likely to add noise to the market price, things that people don't really understand, which means that their argument of price transparency just clogs the price for all. And that means that to the extent, in the worst case scenario for us, this does in fact affect the market price, we don't want that to happen. We want the public exchange to be insulated from that, and we want only institutional investors to trade in that. For those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
More access is bad, is if that access gives them access to a bad thing where they could lose their money. That is why this negative team loses. I'm going to ask two questions in reply. Firstly on brokerages defaulting, secondly on information flow. Firstly on brokerages defaulting. They say the risk that brokerages default is what allows them to get zero-free trading. And then I think they just trail off there. Because they never explain, as they concede at the negative and in reply, why, for example, trading is better than having an ETF. Maybe you're allowing them access to a greater array of choices, but if accessing those choices only ever hurts them, then that's bad. We should actually restrict that access. Then they later at reply seem to concede that, but the way Robinhood makes its money is by taking up the other side of stupid retail traders doing stupid things. That's how Robinhood continues to make its money. But that explains why we in fact shouldn't allow Robinhood to take the other side of that trade, because it hurts ordinary people. Second thing I'm now going to do is going to weigh this. Because note, the mechanism is the same. We both agree that zero-free trading could possibly happen, but that's also the way in which brokerages could possibly default. Because they are now acting as market makers, when they take that possible reward, they also need to take an associated risk. And then we point out down the bench that that risk is non-trivial because, for example, the GFC, Ukraine, COVID, even no one is perfect, therefore that probability is non-trivial. So how should you then weigh this? Because we tell you that these are a larger scale of harm. In particular, we tell you that when these harms accrue, they are correlated, such that the government has to step in to support everyone. That, for example, because the brokerage loses everyone's stock all at once, that everyone needs to now be supported by the government. And that, we tell you, is incredibly bad, because this affects macroeconomic trends that can hurt governments in general. It can hurt economic growth. That is a much larger scale than if you additively just summed up all the subtraction, cheaper brokerages that people make. But also on the weighing metric of vulnerability. We told you that these people are the most vulnerable, are hurt the most by brokerages defaulting. Because these people have the fewest in saving. Because they're likely to have put all their eggs in the brokerage basket, which means if they get hurt also most by the economic crisis. Because it's often people with the least secure jobs which get fired the quickest in economic crises, which explains why they also are the ones hurt most. So on the vulnerability metric, brokerage defaulting hurt those people most. Look, at the end of the day, lots of people having access to a market is not inherently good. If we increase the probability that the GFC could happen again, that the market going to zero or their brokerage portfolio going to zero happens a lot more, that explains why we undermine the mechanism. Second question on this then, on information transfer. The first push was to explain why you could possibly regulate it. But we pointed out at Felix that if you did regulate it, this would make it so expensive that they were unable to access their only benefit, which was zero-fee brokerage. So either you hide some information, in which case you get zero-fee brokerage, but if there's any kind of lack of information transfer at all, that necessarily is required for you to get their only benefit. But then they say, maybe this hidden information isn't very valuable because it's just the information provided by retail investors, and fuck them, what do they know? But obviously this is uncomparative because they themselves are the ones who are happy to talk about GameStop, talk about retail investors being very important, possibly making a lot of money in these cases. When retail investors dominate the price transfer or like the majority of what determines a price, this is where it's very important for institutional investors to take up the other part of the trade. Because if it is the case that GameStop actually has no underlying asset, then it's good for market allocation to keep betting against retail investors. That's why the information dissemination is in fact incredibly important, as opposed to the price kept spiking and spiking, so that retail investors kept like thinking they were gonna make some money and they would get further and further on the hype train. That explains why the stickiness is in fact bad, even if it just hurts other retail investors. Happy to affirm.
To qualify for human rights.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah.
It's on the recording, dude.
He said, "Oh,
Can you elaborate on that?
I disagree strenuously with that position.
Alright, thank you everyone, this was a good debate. Firstly, some general feedback, then the result, and then the explanation. Overall, I thought this was above average quality and relatively close. So, in terms of general feedback, 3 points of general feedback, then some facts that might have been useful for the debate, and then everything else. The general feedback is going to be pretty boring stuff. More direct rebuttal to each other would be useful. Many premises required more explanation or more proof of like those where those occur. And finally, there was a substantial lack of impacting or explanation of why various things mattered in the debate. So for example, the negative team doesn't really spend very much time explaining why it's good for people to be able to trade more. We just hear the words like, people can trade more and more easily, repeated a large number of times. But it's like unclear why it's good that you can trade more and more easily. Similarly, the affirmative team will often say like, and this exposes people to risks. And it's like, well, what risks? Why do those risks matter? What are the implications of those risks, etc. So, some facts that could have been useful for the debate. There's 6 of them. Firstly, stock exchanges are not highways. Secondly, brokerages do in the status quo have an obligation to provide price improvement when engaging in internalization. So they can only, if they don't want to put your trade through the stock exchange, they have to give you a better price than you would have gotten through the stock exchange. This becomes a feature of the negatives counter model, but is also just an empirical fact that could have been pointed out by teams. Thirdly, how do brokerages make money in the status quo? By far the largest way that brokerages make money is by what's called net interest, which is just that they invest all the money you keep in your brokerage account until you buy stocks with it. That is the biggest way that they make money. The second biggest contributor to money is something called payment for order flow, which is that market makers pay them money in order to be allowed to trade against their retail investors. The third way is via commissions. Most countries have abolished, or in most countries, brokerages no longer charge commissions or offer zero commission trading. Australia is an exemption largely because we have CHESS sponsorship for stock trading, which is a different, more complex model for the custody of shares. That might be worth knowing because it's a relatively unique feature of Australia, and therefore our markets operate quite differently to how other countries do. And this debate obviously would occur in a global setting. Who are market makers? Generally people like Jane Street, Citadel, or Millennium, so big prop firms or hedge funds. Sometimes brokers do act as their own market makers, so Commonwealth Bank is its own market maker on Commsec. This is actually relatively rare. So there could have been more discussion about who the market makers were, why they're doing it, what they get out of it, etc. Fifthly, it's not necessary to sell your shares to transfer brokers. You can actually, in Australia, because of CHESS sponsorship, just port your shares across. In other countries, you can do what's called an in-kind transfer to avoid CGT, or the equivalent. And finally, stock trading disclosures are distinct from access to market information. So the stock market doesn't tell you who is traded, it just tells you that these shares are traded and the amount and price. There is a separate requirement by regulators like ASIC or the SEC for large institutional investors to reveal when they've bought or sold shares. And similarly, there are tax requirements to do so. Those things are distinct. None of these 6 pieces of information factored into the decision at all, because obviously that would be entering, but these are just things that might be useful for teams to know. Alright, so in what was a relatively close debate, I awarded this to side negative. Why is that the case? The TLDR is, I think, side negative is able to gain a benefit in terms of access, although one they could have impacted substantially better. I think in terms of the argument on market efficiency, negative is able to prove that there are some ways in which the market becomes more efficient. Negative is able to prove there are some ways in which the market becomes less efficient. I think this doesn't really tip the debate very aggressively in either side, but might be very narrowly won by side negative. The final argument on stability, I think side affirmative is able to identify a harm to stability, but not one that is impacted sufficiently to outweigh the previous two issues. Let's explore that in a bit more depth. The issue of access, side affirmative says internalization allows for reduced commissions. You don't need to pay exchange fees, which cost money, and you're able to make money either through payment for order flow, i.e. the market makers pay you a fee in order to be able to trade against your clients, or instead you're your own market maker and you make money off your clients from the bid-ask spread. So there are two ways in which you either avoid a cost or are able to make a profit that allows you to lower your commissions. The response we get from this is to say, affirmative says, well, no, you'll have to charge higher commissions because you're taking risk by acting as a market maker, and you'll need to compensate for that risk by charging higher commissions. I think side negative has three responses to this. The first is just like you're choosing to be a market maker. If it was something that cost you money such that you need to raise your fees, you would just choose not to be a market maker, which suggests that probably it has to be a profitable on net activity. Otherwise you wouldn't do it. Secondly, they say like the fact that it's a profitable activity means that it would push in the other direction. And thirdly, I think that they all boil down to effectively that response. I think they point out it is profitable, otherwise you wouldn't do it. The fact that it's profitable means that it must point in the direction of lowering fees. So I don't buy that response from the affirmative team. They then attach one benefit to this, which is that it allows people to trade cheaply or more easily than they otherwise can. And they suggest that this is good because people can enter and exit the market more easily. This seems intuitively good, but I'm unsure what precisely the implications of this are. So I think it could have been impacted a fair bit better. Side affirmative then has another set of responses, or another response which is to say, well, trading more easily isn't necessarily good. In fact, it might encourage people to trade more and in bad ways, which is bad. Side negative has three responses to this claim. Firstly, they say it's unclear that being able to trade more easily or more cheaply means you necessarily do trade more easily or more cheaply. This is true, so maybe people don't trade more, they just trade more cheaply when they do trade otherwise, which is, I guess, a benefit, but concedes that in a sense the benefit side negative is picking up here is small. The second thing they say is trading more isn't not necessarily bad if you know what you're doing, and they give some reasons to believe that the kinds of clients who are probably engaging in these trades are relatively sensible. And finally, they say it's also easier to leave the market, so it might also balance out in that sometimes this allows people to avoid staying in the market when it would be bad, or avoid various harms that accrue. I think this is sufficient to mitigate out the concern, because I don't think side affirmative does enough to explain why people would necessarily trade in bad ways. They point to the potential of that outcome, but don't prove necessarily that it's a likely outcome. So at the end of this argument on access, side negative is able to point out that there is a benefit to access. I'm not sure how big it is, but it is there, and I'm convinced of it. On market efficiency, there are kind of four sub-claims here. Firstly, side affirmative says you get worse price discovery in the world of negative because prices don't all clear through a central exchange, rather they're in different exchanges, which means that you don't have sort of all of the price information being aggregated centrally. Side negative has four responses to this. The first is to say retail trades are only a small subset of total trades, which means that the majority of trades still clear centrally. This is a mitigatory response, but I think an effective one. The second response they say is we will require disclosure of the prices at which trades occur. I think it is within the remit of negative to countermodel doing this. I'm just not sure precisely what it does. In that, like, the information exists somewhere. I'm not sure how it's integrated into anything. Like, I'm not really sure what it's doing, but I guess it can occur. Thirdly, they say you can know the prices on the brokerage apps because the brokerage apps have to display them. I think this is like true. I believe at second that like you can't hide the price that trades are occurring because people need to open the app and see the price at which the trade occurs. But again, I agree that this is like worse than the trades all clearing centrally for the reason that like you can see that there are prices available on different apps, but it's worse than just having one price that everyone agrees is the price. Finally, they say if this encourages more people to trade, that might make markets more efficient, which is plausibly true, but it's never weighed like how many more people are trading or what precisely this means. So I think there is a harm here in worse price discovery, but again, I'm not sure precisely how much worse, and I'm not sure what the implications are. I think we get some implications pointed out. for example, at first affirmative about why this could be bad, like it's good to have accurate pricing to allocate capital, people like certainty when they trade, it would be bad if the stock is plummeting and they didn't know, lots of people are exposed to the market. But some of these are just reasons to kind of like impact why it would be bad if particular bad things happened, rather than explaining why those bad things happen. Like, I'm not sure why this is the difference between people not knowing a stock is plummeting and knowing why a stock is plummeting. It seems like the prices are just slightly more fuzzy, and I think it's unclear what the precise implication of that is. So it's a bit harder to precisely credit this. We also hear that there is now less competition as a result, because you don't have everyone competing on a central exchange. Side negative says, as a result, trading is divided up. Side negative is a couple of responses. Firstly, let's say there's competition between the platforms. Side affirmative says, no, people are loyal, only stick to one platform. Negative says, people aren't loyal, it's easy to set up accounts, there's lots of new traders who they compete over, and then you can trade, even if you've got your existing trades in one account, you can do new trades in another account. So I'm willing to believe that there's still relatively high competition between the various market actors, and that will mean that you have to provide relatively good service. The second claim that app says is just that people don't put that much effort in when it comes to thinking about the various trades. I think this is plausibly true. Like, some people obviously aren't putting in that much effort, but I'm convinced that enough people or enough new traders exist that there is still competitive pressure on everyone to offer relatively good prices for trades. So I think, again, side negative is able to stack up, side affirmative is able to stack up kind of a harm here in that there is less competition, but it's, again, unclear like precisely how much. I think negative is able to mitigate out the exact harms that accrue here. There's two more claims made, one by each team, that I think is underexplained and therefore incapable of really doing much. Affirmative is one claim that is detection of fraud is easier, because there is like a public record, but it's kind of unclear what precise information and in what way you investigate it. And I think, as I pointed to in general feedback, empirically, that's not quite how it works. So I needed more explanation to credit this. Negative has an argument here that's just like the exchanges get clogged up because there's too many trades and we take some out. One, I'm not really sure what this means or how it works. Two, I think it is empirically incorrect. And three, they concede themselves that retail traders are only a small portion of the market, so they concede that they're not really taking very many trades out of the highway in any case. So it doesn't seem like this is particularly unclogging anything. So market efficiency, marginally won by side affirmative, but it's kind of less, it was already unclear, I guess, why neg's benefit in the first argument is important. I think it's less clear why this argument is important. I think the margin here is smaller. The final issue is then on stability. App says market makers will over leverage, and that poses a systemic risk because they might all fail at the same time, the government might have to bail them out, etc., etc. Maybe they're betting against shares that other people own, etc. This would all be bad. There are two responses from side negative, and one kind of additional problem. The first is this relies on market makers also being brokers, which side affirmative points out is possible, but never proves is the most likely scenario. And in the instances where they're different, as side affirmative themselves concedes in the first affirmative speech, that is symmetric, because they point out market makers could over leverage on either side, and it would be bad. It's only worse if they're also the broker, and it's not proven that they necessarily are the broker, so that excludes a set of cases from this harm. The second thing is then responses from side negative, which are broadly just reasons why these people will be well diversified, won't take too much risk, and are unlikely to blow up. All of which I think is like sufficient mitigation that I'm not convinced that this is a particularly huge harm in the debate. So I think there's like some risk of this occurring, but I'm not necessarily clear when or how. I'd also note that this argument kind of gets dropped for most of the debate and then just makes kind of a reappearance at the end and at the beginning. So it's a bit underexplained in terms of the impact here. So I guess this is also like a marginal win to side affirmative, but it's one that's very speculative and hard to credit. So at the end of the debate, negative is kind of able to establish this access benefit. Affirmative has two harms, but they're insufficient to weigh over. So marginally, negative is able to take the debate.
Cool. Do you have time?
Yeah.
Alright, too easy. Thanks everyone.
Can we catch you after then?
Yep.